So welcome all of you to this afternoon's Wednesday seminar, which is on a very important theme, essentially, discussing deterrence vis-a-vis China. And the backdrop to this exploration will be Colonel Gautam Das's new book, Mountain Warfare and the Indian Army Towards Effective Deterrence Capability. This is the book which has just come out. Now, Colonel Das, man of many parts. He spent 23 years in Indian Armed Forces, working in different capacities, but with a very special love for the mountains. So he was deployed in mountainous areas, theme of his book, and its mountain warfare is one area he has studied deeply, both on the basis of his personal experience on the ground at Corps headquarters, and subsequently, as an eminent, researcher and author on these issues. In fact, he has as many as 6 books on defense and security issues to his credit. And we are very happy that Gautam is also adjunct fellow with the Institute of Chinese Studies. So when this book came out, I requested Gautam that why don't you, make a presentation for us in our Wednesday seminar. He said book is a bit too, technical for lay audience. But I will talk more about, deterrence vis-a-vis China, which is explored in the book, but among many other subjects. Now, as you know, India seeks constructive engagement with China, but at the same time it's a fraught relationship. And this relationship, deterrence is absolutely critical. More so now, given China's increasingly assertive profile and its quest of its contested territorial claims, which are sometimes described as China's core interests that are non-negotiable. So, how to put in place deterrence that will discourage any reckless behavior on our northern neighbor is a theme of great importance in our discourse, not only within defense security circles, but indeed as part of larger public debate. We have a particular situation vis-a-vis China. As you know, the Chinese economy is now 5 times the size of Indian economy. If you look at SEPRI figures, China's defense budget is about 4.5 times the size of India's defense budget. So a deterrence based on equivalence is not a practical proposition for us. So it has to be a symmetrical response when we talk about deterring China, both along the land borders as well as now also in the maritime domain, which is becoming more active. Now this is one theme Colonel Gautam Das has studied in depth, including in this book, and he goes into issues like need for a mountain strike force and joint air-land organization, deterrence based on the concept of offensive defense. Now here again, when we look at idea of deterrence not being based only on defensive capabilities, but a mix of defensive and offensive capabilities, we have to bear in mind the fact that China's defense profile is also undergoing very rapid transformation in terms of military assets, in terms of military structures, and in terms of military doctrines, which have to be taken into account. Like when we talk about joint air-land organization, China has already put in place theater command in place of earlier military regions. So to discuss these issues, I think we have a highly qualified and competent commentator, and we're really fortunate that Gautam will be discussing these issues. So I'll request Gautam Das to make his presentation, and then we'll have discussions. Gautam.
Thank you, Ambassador Kantha. I am honored that the ICS actually wanted to take up a discussion on this book, and in the preliminary discussion I mentioned that it should be a discussion based on the book rather than a discussion on the book, for reasons which he has also explained. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here this afternoon, and we have together till about, all right, right. We have ample time is the indication I get, and since there are not that very many of us, there will be ample time for actual discussion. I thank you all very much for being here today and joining us here. With that, I'd like you to take a look at some background points that I put down in writing. I'm not going to show any slides other than this few points on these 2 pages and a couple of thinker cartographic impressions. I'm avoiding a particular word which the government of India doesn't like. So with that, the aim of my discussion today is what I'd like to tell you, that I'm going to move on to deterrence vis-a-vis China very rapidly, but I will briefly lay out what is in the book, just for point of interest, because after all that's the starting point. So I request Rebecca to slowly help in moving this upwards. I'd request those of you here to just kindly read through to the end, and we'll take a very short pause once these few points are done, so that in case anyone wishes to take exception to anything that I've said, we can discuss it and get over with it before we actually get onto the book and then deterrence vis-a-vis China. In case anybody can't read it, please let me know that I'll read it out from this. So Rebecca, please, very slowly. The first is the aim, which I've already told you. I have thereafter a few premises which I'd like you to look at. Disagree with what I've said, or to question it, or to allow discussion, or want a discussion on any of these points, we can do that for a few minutes, should anyone wish to. If you don't disagree, and then I shall proceed, because this is a background that I'm taking. Our discussion today is not on these points, and therefore I'm assuming that all of you are in agreement with this is the kind of background thought process. Yeah, sure, go ahead, use your...
One point, sir. The third point which we have written, the premise that India believes Pakistan's deployment of TNWs to be destabilizing.
This one?
Yes.
Right.
So this is little debatable. I mean to say, we can't be saying that this is really destabilizing, because it's actually not making much of a difference till the time the TNWs, firstly we know their worth, and secondly we know the quantum, and thirdly we know the methodology of using them at what point in time and space by Pakistan, and their actual policy on that. Is it really going to affect us? And if it is going to affect us, definitely it is going to affect us, but in tactical and maybe a little bit in operational domain. But destabilizing probably may be a little strong word to use here. That's what.
Thank you for your comment. The term destabilizing within single inverted commas that I have used here has been used in a recent book by a very well-known author on Indian defense policy, and in one of his recent books also. I can name him, you can look up his book, Brigadier Gurmeet Kamal, retired. You can look up his current book. And I have been in discussions on nuclear usage within think tanks, government think tanks, where the term has been used and not bandied about, deliberately used. We could go into a little amount of detail. In fact, I was going to take up tactical nuclear weapons, or at least their delivery vehicles, as part of my talk. Pakistan not being part of the subject specifically, or policy vis-a-vis Pakistan, but let me answer your point, since you're from the MEA, and I believe that what you've just spoken is perhaps the official standpoint. So let me explain myself a little bit on what I understand from this and why I'm using a term which is being used. And as I said, I can quote Gurmeet Kanwal on this, not by page number and so on at the moment, but you'll find it in his book. He has a whole chapter on it, actually. To believe that tactical nuclear weapons vis-a-vis Pakistan's having them is not destabilizing is a belief we are welcome to hold. But the fact is, as General Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, not Rafi Ahmed Kidwai, General Kidwai, the Pakistani nuclear strategist and thinker and the person who put this entire thing in place, who just recently, after many extensions after his retirement, has finally retired. He's drawn these red lines which they are deliberately not laid down on ground, in the sense that they have not been delimited in words. There have been numerous think tank exercises even recently on how the Indian armed forces can fight their way through it. Their numbers are not enough to affect and so on. But everybody agrees, and this is the point I'm trying to make to you, that Pakistan's first use policy, which I haven't mentioned here, which it's a stated policy by their government as part of their full spectrum deterrence, which is also part of their official policy, is that if any nuclear weapon is used in the India-Pakistan context, there is no distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear in the India-Pakistan context. If anybody uses a nuclear weapon, no matter how small, even the what is called the nominal weapon, 20 kiloton, and we can discuss nuclear weapons again later, right? I mean, from my amount of knowledge, or limited pool of knowledge, but nevertheless, I'm prepared to discuss with an MEA representative on this. Can we just say that a lot of people in India, thinking people with knowledge of this subject, do believe it is destabilizing? Number one. We'll discuss the implications a bit later as we go on. Number two, at the same time, a lot of the Indian armed forces currently serving and recently retired, particularly those who have been in the mechanized forces, believe they can fight their way through it. What is destabilizing is the fact that Pakistan says they will use it, and they will use, instead of counter value targets, which means cities like where we are sitting, or counter force targets in general. But they will use it against attacking Indian forces as tactical. That is what is being considered destabilizing. We'll go into it in a little more detail, but vis-a-vis some other aspect.
I had a minor point. To put it simply, I think Colonel Das, you will agree with me. Destabilizing, to the extent it means that it tends to lower the nuclear threshold. Basically is that.
Fair enough, sir. I completely agree with you. You've put it much better, put it across much better and more simply than I have. Shall I take it that we can move on?
Just one, certain clarification. When you refer to China's first use policy against nuclear weapons possessing states, China formally may not regarded India as nuclear weapons possessing state, but NFU applies to both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. So it's not that NFU. So one way or other, India is not excluded from purview of NFU. And this is something I'm deliberately asking that question because I'm aware of there is a contrary view, but this cannot be taken as a sort of accepted. The interpretation is my own applies to India as well. But I'm aware of people who have different point of view. I just wanted to point that out.
No, it's definitely worth pointing out since I've kept these as a background. I defer to Ambassador Kantha's superior knowledge and wisdom on this particular subject. That is indeed the position. Nevertheless, from my study of it, and as he says, the contrarian viewpoint among various Indians, is that it is ambiguous enough for them to exclude India should they want to. And if we can agree to disagree on that little aspect, I think we can proceed on that.
Colonel Das, when it comes to policy like NFU, these are declaratory policies. So frankly, once you cross the nuclear threshold, there's no point quibbling on whether or not NFU applies to country A or country B.
Fair enough, Ambassador Kantha. I think that's a very valid point from a seasoned diplomat with vast experience in China and the China policy aspect, wherein this is a major factor. We can move on. We'll take his definition of it, and mine is therefore to that extent qualified and overridden by his definition. We can accept that quite happily. I accept it in toto. Moving on. Ambassador Kantha, on behalf of the ICS, undertook a very kind of dangerous move in inviting a retired army officer to speak to what would essentially be a captive audience, particularly above the age of 65. Like many or most perhaps men of over 65, a captive audience is an invitation to keep talking. And as my wife tends to point out, she's here today to keep a check on this aspect, I suppose. But at the same time, it's even more dangerous for ex-army people because of the when I was itis disease or when I was itis factor. I'll try and stay away from that. I think I should succeed to about 99%. That the 1% I know of, but with your permission, I might inject it if it becomes necessary. With that as a caveat, so to speak, I would say that this book was actually intended for a military audience. At more or less two ends of the serving military spectrum. One was the junior, for whom there would be certain things of interest or of knowledge, particularly if they had not served in the mountains, which means practicing for war in most cases. When you say serving in the mountains, to a civilian audience that may mean borders pe tainat the. It's a very common question military people get asked. Have you served on the borders? Have you served in the northern borders? Now they don't understand what it means by serving, and quite frankly they're not to blame. The issue is that even when you're on pickets on an active border which you're holding by force, otherwise the other side would change it, such as the line of actual control, I beg your pardon, this was a mistake, the line of control and the actual ground position line with Pakistan. Even there's an element of preparations for what's called hot war, in the sense of exercises which practice your operational possibilities. So it's not merely sort of sitting tight. And on the other borders, there's definitely a lot of that, because the sitting tight is not really necessary, because there's nobody pushing from the other side trying to grab pieces of your territory. So to these, and these happen to people on rotation, in the sense units move up, units move down, and younger officers who have not had the opportunity to go up would probably find something of interest or new to them. There is also this Indian problem which I was trying to address, of not looking at our own history. We are very short-sighted in India. We don't look at history, even recent history. The actions of the J&K War of 1947-48, including those in the mountains, some of us may have read. When I say some of us, I mean some of those of us who were in uniform, even while we were in uniform. And I'm quite sure today that most people are not reading anything about it, because we're not interested. And so it is. 65, there were certain actions in the mountains. 71, there was a fair amount of action in the mountains. It may not have been internationally, politically significant in the terms of creating another country like Bangladesh. But militarily, there were a lot of small in the sense they did not capture large chunks of territory or lose large chunks of territory. But actions failing, practical issues of trying to capture positions, and so on, in different climates, forested, rocky, glaciated, at different times of year. These are all practical issues which affect the military profession in their functioning, should they be called to war, or even on a daily basis in actually holding static defenses against an aggressive neighbor such as Pakistan, which does not believe that there should be a border there in the first place. So with that aim in view, it was for the junior officers. For the senior, it was the issue of the Mountain Strike Corps. Those who have left the army, they are not in a position to influence anything. But there are, in the Major General, Lieutenant General age group, a lot of people who are in powerful decision-making positions or will move into them, who could influence the way we utilize what we have now committed ourselves to creating for political reasons, and that is the Mountain Strike Corps. It's been talked about in the newspapers and in various other media subjects, media such as the audiovisual, print, or all of it. There have been detailed and fairly extensive reasoning given for why we are doing it. There have been the counters by the Navy to say, why should we spend this much money here? We should be spending the same amount of money to build more warships and dominate the Indian Ocean region more clearly as a counter to anything India may do, China may do in the mountain. So I wanted to bring out whatever was there in the published literature, open literature in the public domain, and analyze it from the point of view of an academic, which is where I was placing myself, but an academic with a fair amount of military experience and knowledge. To that extent, the upper end of the has been addressed by my critiquing the reasoning for the particular construction that is actually happening on ground. The Corps headquarters is in Panagarh, driving between Kolkata and Asansol, or even to Durgapur, one passes Panagarh on the road to Delhi. This is the Delhi highway, the Grand Trunk Express. I mean, we can see it there, it's there. And why it is there has been discussed by others, again in the open press. I have gone into some of these aspects of practicality. The ability to move quickly into a mountain deployment requires a minimum 14 days acclimatization period. I'm not going into the details now. There is also the issue of whether you're going to keep it centrally located, in addition to the acclimatization factor, or are we worried about both the east and the west, meaning it's going to be Ladakh or Himachal or Uttarakhand or only Arunachal Pradesh? If it is only Arunachal Pradesh, is this the best place to keep it? So far the indications by whatever government releases have come, and of course by whatever has been discussed in the press, include talks about an Eastern India focus, which means Arunachal primarily. It also implies that if it is going to be a mountain strike corps, if it is a strike corps, since the term has come into it, it would mean that it is going to be a riposte. And I'm using this term because Brigadier Deepak Sinha, who's here today and has written extensively on this subject in various articles, he writes, he's with the Observer Research Foundation, he writes a blog, his articles come in the Pioneer and various other places, and he has argued that we need to strike across the mere, and he's given further military details, some of which I've quoted here, quoting him and citing his earlier works. But if you're going to strike, now you're left with pondering two options. Is it going to be a riposte? If so, it has to be away from where China has perhaps either struck or is about to strike. And it will also essentially mean it's going to go onto the Tibetan plateau, which requires a different type of organization, both equipment-wise and thinking-wise. Or is it going to be a strike through the actual Himalayas, which is actual mountain warfare? On the Tibetan plateau, it's no longer mountain warfare. It's plateau warfare, but there are some mountains, yes. But the physical aspects of both are entirely different. In fact, the Chinese and the Monpas and things, this Monjul is actually a ravine dweller. Monpa is ravine dweller, so they refer from the Tibetan perspective, the Himalayas are the ravine territory. I mean, sheer ups and downs. It's the verticality of the terrain which affects all military operation, a thing I've tried to express in the book. So now, with an ambitious, large mountain strike corps being whittled down by the current NDA government, the current Bajpa government, down to a much smaller force, how is that to be employed? That is a subject that I have discussed here to some extent. Now, given that the Mountain Strike Corps is focused on the east, as per statement by physical location, we need to know why it is like that. And for that reason, I'd like to show you something which is something that in my understanding, the PRC would like to see, and it is in the form of a map. Now, this, I've called it India 2049, and I'm sure the MEA and everybody else will be very annoyed to see this, which is why it's not going to be published. but I'll draw your attention to a few features, some of which may have been immediately apparent to you. One is that east of Bhutan there is no India. And 2049, by the way, is the Chinese overcoming the 100 years of domination by foreign powers and so on and so forth. Taking 100 years to get over it, 1949 to 2049. This date, by the way, has been stated in the China Dream and so on and so forth, even in the 19th Party Congress. So I am not disputing the date with you. You all can look it up, and most of you know it. But if that is the kind of threat, then you have nothing east of the Siliguri corridor. This is a stylized map. That triangular point going up is Darjeeling and then Sikkim. Pakistan would like to take Bangladesh all the way up to the Bhutan border. As we know, in Lower Assam, the demography has changed to the extent that it's become more Muslim than Bodo, who are the original inhabitants there, Dhuburi and all those neighboring districts. Very well documented, I don't have to say it. Now, this darker outlined India 2049 is what would be part of the China Dream. And there have been enough indications. Since we're not going to discuss it, this is what the threat problem is. On the top, that point is the Karakoram Pass. To the right of it, sloping southeastwards, is a line which is more or less the line of actual control. In other words, Aksai Chin is off, held by the Chinese already. From the point which is the Karakoram Pass, there's actually a ridgeline which goes leftwards, that is westwards, which presently is sort of controlled, if not controlled, but not controlled by anyone else other than us, is a better description. And then we have the actual ground position line coming more or less southwards, not shown here. And then we have this line of control, and which leaves us effectively with this much of JNK. This is not our official JNK map. Now, if that be so, this is what we are preparing against. to prevent this kind of thing happening. And just to elaborate on this, and I'll take another minute or so, Rebecca, if we can have the other one. The next one will just show you what happens to the rest. No, the next one. What happens to the rest? And this, you've passed it a couple of times, Rebecca. Yeah, that's the one. The Indian border will become on the eastern zone of Sikkim and come all the way down along the West Bengal Bangladesh border. Bhutan will be that way. Arunachal is part of Tibet, and South Tibet disappears off the map. Bangladesh goes up to the Bhutan border. These individual states will be in whatever form they'll be there. This is what probably they're trying to do. Pakistan certainly wants to break India into so many different states, and the China factor we've talked about. But this is what we are trying to prevent. Right, that's it, thank you. That's all I'm going to show. Now the problem with looking at deterrence vis-a-vis China is, you can switch this off also. And I'll take just a little more time to explain something that I've gone into in the book, but in a very brief form. Now, deterrence vis-a-vis China, we have a government policy, obviously, and those of us present who have been in the MEA have spent their entire lives working on it, detailing it, practicing the diplomacy that goes with it. And those of us who are in the armed forces side have been involved with the military aspects of it, Army, Navy, Air Force, DRDO, Missile Force. So let's look at what are the components. One of the components is, of course, the missile force. Now we have an Agni 5 which can reach Beijing. How many of them we have, etc., is besides the point now. Whether they are meant to be used or not, I have already talked about. The mere fact is that we have taken a conscious decision to have a strategic missile force, asymmetric though it may be in terms of numbers and in yields, and I'm not even comparing circular errors of probability and so on and so forth, which go into any nuclear missile discussion. So we have some, in some quantities, we have missiles that can reach the Han heartland. The next is the Navy. Yes, the presence of the Navy as surface combatants is a deterrent to China's expansion and into and domination of the Indian Ocean region. The Navy is actually highly cognizant of this and has been the only one of the three services which has been working towards this from before the other two services, the Air Force and the Army. And they brought out their own policy document early. They've had a good shipbuilding or warship construction plan which they've been working on, which includes acquisitions, rentals, and leasing, and so on. I do talk about the ballistic missile component of the Navy, which is one arm of the nuclear weaponry triad, which has nothing to do with domination of the Indian Ocean. And that will also carry ballistic missiles targeted at the Han heartland as a floating component and thereby, or submerged actually, and thereby immune to the first strike that could come in, and therefore ideal for a second strike. We have a problem here, I've mentioned it. As you all know from the papers, we have this one under lease. We have one under lease and one under build. The countries, small countries, which have tried to have a nuclear ballistic submarine, SSBN as they're called, SSBN program during the Cold War were France and Britain. And the British term is continuous at-sea deterrence, just to use the appropriate word, CASD. I've mentioned it in the book. Now, it really requires 4 boats, not 1 and not 2. The reason it requires 4 is that 1 is deployed, 1 is under training, 1 is under refit, and 1 is under this refit and maintenance. So these are the basic, and 1 is getting ready to replace the other on deployment. They need 4. We can possibly bring it down to 3, but you cannot do with 2 or with 1. If you have 2, your availability, if you have 1, your availability is 1/4 of the time or 1/3 of the time, based on the same parameters. If you have 2, you may have for about half the time or a little more than half the time, but you will not have 100% of the time. In other words, until we have the requisite number, whether that is on a tight schedule kept to 3 or brought to 4, this particular SSB and arm of ours is going to take some time to be ready. A word here about, for this discussion. I haven't deliberated on the book because and most people who read this probably are aware of it, is the issue of aircraft carriers versus submarines. Now, basic naval policy, and I'm not talking about the geopolitical aspect, not Mahan, who wrote the best book on the subject, was an American admiral. British policy, British foreign policy, and of course in the colonial era, its economic policy also was greatly dependent on the Royal Navy. And the basic British policy was to spend most of their money on the Royal Navy, because it was their force in being, which could be employed anywhere from actual warfare to transport. The force in being theory is now no longer so valid on the naval sphere. The only place where we seem to be using it is in the Indian Army, where we are holding these strike corps of mechanized forces more or less as a force in being. But since neither China or Pakistan are likely to attack us in the plains, I don't know how long this force in being theory, though they're not consciously applying it, whether it's applicable to the land or not. But the aircraft carrier groups of the US Navy are actually the strongest force in the world for force projection. In fact, the US Navy is the second largest air force in the world, which many of you know. It's larger than the air forces of all other countries other than the US. And they carry entire divisions of infantry which belong to the Navy, the US Marine divisions, afloat. And basically Chinese anti-access area denial policy is to keep these ones at bay. They're immensely strong forces. But if nuclear war comes into play by any side, they'll have to scuttle for some safe port, whether home ports or next to some port where they are no longer vulnerable. What comes into play thereafter is submarines. So now we have these two issues of aircraft carrier groups or submarines. Submarines can give you a policy of sea denial, which is one of the two current naval policies. Aircraft carriers give you sea control. Which of the two are relevant for us in the Indian Ocean region? We have not yet been able to make up our minds, because we are doing, our Navy is growing, it's well thought out, it's growing well, but it's growing as a sort of a pie slice of a big power Navy like in particular the Americans, because there are no other big power navies. The Soviet Navy was a submarine predominant navy meant to keep the same carrier groups away from the access points to the Soviet Union. The Chinese Navy started, the PLAAN started as a brown water navy to prevent access onto their shores. It is now has become in a great extent a blue water navy. So the Navy as a deterrent, the surface control is applicable, that is sea control is applicable for us in the Indian Ocean region. Sea denial, if we wish to take deterrence to that level against China, then we have to focus on a much larger fleet of underwater killer submarines, of which there is no evidence yet. The ballistic submarines, ballistic missile submarines, I've already talked about. The Air Force as an arm of the deterrent triad. The Air Force actually needs the reach to take nuclear bombs onto the Han heartland if it is to be considered a arm of the strategic triad. Presently, we have only one aircraft which can do it, and that too with refueling, air-to-air refueling by tankers, the tankers themselves being vulnerable while in the air. And that is the Sukhoi 30, which the Chinese also have. We have not either consciously or as a policy matter in trying to keep one arm of the triad weak, or because of cost, not gone in for strategic bombers, which in my opinion we should have had. At least, if not for the Han heartland, at least we should have strategic bombers for the Navy to cover up to the Straits of Mumbai and Vetar. Why the Straits of Mumbai and Vetar? Because those are the only straits through which Chinese or any other force's nuclear submarine can sail submerged from the South China Sea into the Indian Ocean. And we're not covering that with adequate aircraft range. We should have had bombers which could at least engage up to there. The same bomber could also have been nuclear missile capable. We were offered the Tu-122 by the Soviets. We, at a good price in those days, we declined it. The ideal would have been what the Australians had, though it wasn't a very efficient aircraft, but it was designed with the same parameters. The F-111 strategic bomber, very fast, very low, and 2,500 kilometer operating radius is the kind of thing we needed. We don't have it. So one arm is weak there. That brings me to what I have discussed in the book, land warfare on the plateau. What is a deterrent to China on the plateau or in mountain warfare? If you have a land warfare component, it is a deterrent only if you can use it for the riposte. Otherwise, you're going to be forced to use it, which is my fear. I've expressed it here. Is that whenever there is a panic, the strike corps gets used in counter-penetration or in counter-attack roles, either in a local counter-attack or maybe a slightly larger scale. But it does not get used for a riposte. If it cannot get used for a riposte, it's not a mountain strike corps. Now, the details of what it requires to be a strike corps in terms of organization, Ambassador Kantha already pointed out. It needs to be a joint airland entity for obvious reasons, because if you're going to move anything fast, it has to be by air, which would be helicopters, which would be airborne forces, air assault, paratroop, both types, depending on where they are to actually drop or land. To be able to use air, you need to have a favorable local air situation. I'm using the Air Force term, which requires enough aircraft over the area with combat air patrols all the time. And all this requires a huge amount of coordination, which means you require joint headquarters. We don't have them yet. We won't debate that, but I'm just pointing out we are talking about deterrence vis-a-vis China. So we need those. There is immense resistance from the Air Force. But I have suggested some particular ways and means. Now, brigade-based corps, divisional-based corps, pros, cons, I have discussed in the book. I'm not going to discuss them here. We are taking deterrence at the level at which we in the ICS would be interested, at which we in the Center for Land Warfare Studies and in the Army, since I'm in that world as well, that's in the book. Needn't go into it here. So we've looked at our missile force. We've looked at the Navy in two forms, in the SSBN as part of the nuclear deterrence against mainland China triad, and sea control as part of the Indian Ocean dominance, which is also a bit of a deterrence to China. And we've looked at the Air Force where we seem weak because we are down to 35-ish operating squadrons, whereas the original estimate, as you would have seen in the papers, those of you who follow, was 45. And now the Air Force is saying we need 42. We are still far from where we need to be. So you can ponder over whether we have any form of deterrence vis-a-vis China or we don't have. Now, the issue of tactical nuclear weapons, the point which was brought up. When our nuclear theorists talk about our issue or the symmetry, conventional versus non-conventional and so on, the aspects of war capability vis-a-vis Pakistan, this issue of tactical nuclear weapons keeps coming up. We've already had a little part discussion on it. Nobody really mentions the fact that given our own policy, which I had laid out as background, we should not have tactical nuclear weapons. Yet we have made them, and we are continuing to progress. The Prithvi range is changing into the Prahar range. There's an army version, a naval version, and an air force version. If that is our policy, why do we have this? If you put yourself in Pakistan's shoes, our tactical nuclear weapons are destabilizing. I would argue that we should have a declaratory policy for these short-range tactical nuclear or tactical nuclear capable ballistic missiles targeted against the Tibetan plateau in China's occupation. Not at the Han heartland as an asymmetrical deterrent, because asymmetrical because of the numbers, but definitely as war-fighting instruments, whether using conventional warheads, that is high explosive HE warheads, or nuclear capable. And we make a declaratory policy that we will not use nuclear, but these missiles will be used if necessary. The deliberate ambiguity that is being pursued in our missile policy has made no mention of these weapons, and they keep getting tested, and there's a lot of enthusiasm in the press, our press, which is a lot of chest beating and saying, oh, we've got these and we're doing this and so on. And nobody seems to discuss or debate the effects of the rationale of having these and where they are to be used. I would definitely argue that we should declare that these are not meant for Pakistan, and they have military usefulness against the Tibetan plateau. At best, the FS version against those two missile units of the Chinese in Yunnan, one at Chuxiao and one near Kunming. And other than those two missile units of the Chinese in Yunnan, the rest, we can openly say that they're against Chinese assets emplaced in Tibet. Also against future build-ups, if they choose to build up against us. I would like to end my discussion on deterrence here, because ground forces, in terms of infantry, mountain divisions and so on, occupying practically all the mountain tops along the border, it's not part of deterrence. In fact, my position is that if you have enough deterrent capability, you can reduce the amount of troops that you're deploying on the mountains. And troops are expensive these days because it's a career, and we have made it so by giving a longer term to our soldiers. It's not a national or conscript army, which is a much cheaper army, because the conscripts are paid only a stipend while they're there for their 2 or 2.5 years. 2 years is a very common norm, but France before the First World War actually got scared of the German conscription system and upped it to 2.5 years or 3 years eventually. which again becomes more expensive by sheer numbers because the number of divisions increases when you have that many. With the population size of ours, it's not part of this subject, nor is it part of the book, though I've talked about it briefly. We should be having a posture which is based on national service and a national army as opposed to a fully professional army. But it's not a deterrent. It's in no way a deterrent. A deterrent is those 3 or 4 things that I've talked about. I would like to end here and talk about deterrence vis-a-vis China. In the slide, you would have noticed that I mentioned that it includes diplomacy, which I haven't touched on. But I've said diplomacy and military preparedness. I've only talked to the military preparedness side. But I trust I have managed to convey a certain amount of ideas to you for us to discuss on. Thank you very much for a patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Colonel Das. So now the floor is open for any questions, comments. Any discussion? Any observation?
Sir, I'm Colonel Ajay, sir. Thank you so much for the presentation, sir, and the book which you wrote. I take it, sir, it's more so for the army crowd as such. And you mentioned something like a riposte, because very few people out here would understand what is a riposte actually. But I just wanted to know, sir, in terms of what has been the China's take as far as the whole this strike code which had come up? Do you cover that in any of the chapters? Their kind of a reaction, and what do they feel about it, and any changes they have done with respect to that, or anything new which they came up into their thinking as far as the strike code is concerned? And second thing I wanted to ask you was in terms of as far as Arunachal Pradesh is concerned, do you take the environment and the infrastructure development in that area also into this as far as the strike code which is coming up, the development which is taking place into that area? I'm not talking as a part of deterrence as such, sir, but as a way towards some progress into that area, which eventually would become a deterrence.
Thank you for your questions. I'll take them one by one. The Chinese reaction to our mountain strike code, in fact, has been documented and noticed by China watchers, and we have some here with us today. My reading of what they have reacted to the mountain strike code was a certain amount of consternation initially that we were thinking in that direction, but thereafter the reaction has been so muted that I think they're not bothered, for the same reasons that I'm not bothered. If I had been in their shoes, I wouldn't have been bothered, because as I've explained, there's a lot of things lacking. Now, if sitting there they feel that our mountain strike code, as in its present thought process and its state of development and deployment and so on, if it's actually not a threat, it's nothing for them to worry about. They don't need to react to it at the moment. But I would like to add here that whatever internal security deployments they have been practicing in terms of actual exercises on the Tibetan plateau, and the bulk of their exercising on the Tibetan plateau has been to keep hold of Tibet, meaning control the Tibetan land and control the Tibetan population, even their military exercises. That is adequate for them to take care of the borders, even with a certain amount of enhanced capability. Plus they have the Chingai Tibet Railway. It's no longer 1952 to 59 period, when in 59 we were feeding them. Thanks to Panchsheel, it was Indian rice and Indian wheat and Indian dal, which was going up from Kalimpong through the traders, which actually fed the PLA. Otherwise, they had starved out the entire Tibetan population. They were going to die of starvation themselves. So they were also under pressure to get this Panchsheel, which, as you know, is called a trade agreement, by the way. And I've known people, a gentleman, in fact, expired the year before last, who was ex-army 42, from 1942, and then joined a large commercial company, which was selling to Tibet. Aspi Modi, who lived in Bhimtal and of course Bombay, Parsi gentleman from the commercial world, ex-army also, Second World War period. And I've met traders in Kalimpong who said, yes, we were selling thousands of kilos of rice. The entire PLA survived because of that. Now, because of the Qinghai-Tibet Railway, they're much better off. There's no fear of famine. They have ample stocks. They've built up the infrastructure to have people there, to house people, and to feed people, and more will keep coming. And that takes care of that. Himachal Pradesh. If you are talking about the hydroelectric schemes, Nathpa, Jhakri, Baspa, and so on, and the possibilities, since you said that has got nothing to do with deterrence, I am answering generally, it's not related to the book. Of course, as you know, and as everybody here can guess, the Indian Armed Forces and the Indian Army in particular have defense plans to hold it. But it's none of that is a deterrent posture to China. No defensive posture is a deterrent by itself unless it's a very strong defensive posture is at most part of a dissuasive posture, which I talked about. Right? So, as far as the environment and the infrastructure goes, we have those big hydroelectric projects coming up. Yes, there could be a problem. I mean, from either side. As far as the environment is concerned, we have had a problem where there was a lake which got created on the Chinese side some years ago, and then when it collapsed, there was a huge flood which washing away villages on either side of the river. So this kind of issue can get created. But since you have brought up the point, let me mention that one of the thought processes of actually stopping a Chinese advance into India has been atomic demolition munitions, as you are aware, ADMs, emplaced at various places in the mountains, particularly at critical places. And we could even make this a declaratory policy. I don't see it as part of deterrence, but it's dissuasion, certainly. It's certainly dissuasion, but would you be deterred by it if you were China? Perhaps not. Even deterrence is applicable should there be an offensive intention. If there is no offensive intention, there's no need for deterrence. I mean, the other side can build up or not build up, it makes no difference. So, atomic demolition munitions can be a strong addition to an existing dissuasive posture, but I don't think it has any impact on our ability to deter, and so therefore it's not a deterrent position. It's part of a nuclear policy, yes, but it's not a deterrent, in my understanding. Does that answer your questions to any extent?
In this respect, I would like to draw your kind attention. I think it was in 1964 or 65, Brigadier Palit, ex-DGFO, he wrote an article in the India Quarterly about using nuclear weapons to thwart Chinese aggressive actions and actual movement down. So in fact, whatever you said about the demolition mission, the precursor was, in fact, that concept was always working.
Sorry. In terms of deterrence, you've not talked about special forces or the ability of the Air Force to interdict the Tibetan plateau itself. That, I think, would make a very big difference, because to just add, I'd just like to say that we're not actually seeing a war against China, because China is 5 times our size or whatever. If we have to fight, we're fighting Tibet, and we're not fighting China. For China to project forces into Tibet have their own dynamics and their own problems. And if we are able to actually block those access routes, they have a far bigger problem and vulnerability than we have.
You make 2 points, Deepak. Brigadier Deepak Sinha is, of course, paratrooper with extensive experience and knowledge. He's also written a book on the Special Forces, and he has talked about this in the media, in the open, and I have quoted him on the very subject that he has spoken about. So it's there in the book. The reason I did not mention it now, Deepak, was that I see that as an essential part of any military operation that we might need to undertake, whether in a defensive or dissuasive situation or in a deterrence situation. And yes, I agree that we would require to use them in the way that you have mentioned. But personally, I do not see special forces as a deterrent on their own, as part of the entire thing. I mean, I'm boiling it down to more basic essentials. You've gone into it. In fact, whatever you've said is already here. So I agree with you. In this discussion, I have not talked about special forces by themselves being a deterrent for a reason that I kept it down to the very fundamentals of deterrence. And undoubtedly, special forces will require to be used. And special forces can undertake, in addition to these operational and tactical missions, they can undertake strategic missions in their own right, if so used by the government. But nevertheless, I would still say that I do not see a strong aggressive country getting deterred by special forces actions unless they're extremely critical. I mean, they are decapitating against a head of state or some such thing or throws their entire thing out of disarray. So while it is an essential part by themselves, no, but again, by themselves they're very rarely likely to be used, and that too very carefully thought out at the highest level and in strategic missions, and there I agree completely with Brigadier Deepak Sinha. In fact, I've quoted him on it in the book, so I'm sorry I didn't bring it out, Deepak. I actually believe in what you say. Coming to Tibet, the point that you made. For the Chinese, Tibet, A, is a core issue. B, it is an issue with India because they believe initially believed that we should have it as a buffer, that even now we have even quote-unquote evil designs on Tibet. Partly because His Holiness the Dalai Lama is here, partly we have a force, an element of our special forces is of ethnic Tibetan origin. Most of you know about them. The Special Frontier Force, it's no longer secret because it's got talked about in the press. I was once a member of the force, and Dr. Oberoi mentioned my wearing robes on the last occasion. It happened to be Losar, the Tibetan New Year's Day. And while I was a regimental member of that force, every Losar we used to wear Tibetan dress as part of the regimental kind of thing. I just carried it on that day. But for the Chinese, Tibet is a huge problem. In order to hold Tibet, they have to deploy rapidly and over a vast area. That itself is a practical problem for them. The supply line is the Qinghai-Tibet Railway, which is highly vulnerable to both Indian Air Force interdiction and destruction. Destruction primarily, and then if they keep it running, which they have made arrangements for, they have repair stations every 60 kilometers and repair teams. It is subject to Indian interdiction up to a point from what we have. With aerial refueling, of course, it's subject to interdiction a great distance. The other big problem that the Chinese have in Tibet is the lack of sufficient operational airfields. The airfields they have there, they're dual-use airfields. They're primarily also for induction, rapid induction of troops. PLA onto the ground in Tibet, as I said, for the primary purpose of holding Tibet, only secondarily for anything against India. But the bigger problem is most of these airfields cannot operate large quantities of fighter or combat aircraft. So therefore, they have the problem of, even if they have 2,511 or whatever the figure is of combat aircraft, I don't have the figure here with me, it's available, which is many times what we have. They can't deploy them and operate them from Tibet. Nor can they deploy them against us and operate from the Han heartland, because we're too far away. So the bulk of the PLA Air Force is actually not effective on us. Next, at high altitude, the weapons load that they can take off with is severely limited. Combined weapons and fuel load. So it restricts both their range and the ordnance load that they carry. We are in a much better situation where vis-a-vis Tibet, where our Air Force is concerned. We have airfields all around, right from the Far East up to Kashmir and Ladakh, but Ladakh faces the same height problem. They're all practically at mean sea level. Our aircraft can get into the air with full loads of weaponry as well as with fuel. So they have a problem there. And if we have a riposte, in order to create a favorable air situation, either over all of Tibet or locally over the corridor that we have, our air corridor initially, and thereafter it will be secured by ground, we are in a much better position to be able to do it, which is why I advocated in this book. And so does Brigadier Sinha, though his greater emphasis in the parts which I've quoted him are on this use of special forces. I agree with him. There are others also I've quoted. So Tibet is a major problem for them. Politically, the issue of Arunachal is, we know what it is. I left it there in the beginning, and I'm not discussing the political issues. I have one serious problem, since if they actually use the PLA Air Force's Airborne Corps, it used to be called the 15th Airborne Corps, now it's just the Airborne Corps. If they actually use it, and it's now in brigade groups, it doesn't have divisions, to capture a few of our district headquarters along the Assam-Arunachal border, but inside Arunachal, and some of the more northern ones, we'll have a hell of a time trying to recapture them. And that is a military problem which does not form part of deterrence. It's a defensive issue. I haven't talked about it here, but since we're talking about it, let us also accept that it can be a problem, should they not decide to physically come southwards from the Himalayan crestline and rather occupy places in between and move northwards. It'll be both a military problem as well as a political problem. I hope I have gone further beyond your question, and I trust you are in agreement with me on the basis. Thank you.
I just wanted to have one clarification. No, you suggested change in our declaratory policy in respect to what you described as short-range tactical nuclear weapon capable missiles, to open up the possibility of use against use on Tibetan plateau. Don't you think this will be not a minor modification but a complete sea change in our nuclear policy, and it will also kind of position we have vis-a-vis Pakistan's tactical nuclear weapons, what you refer to being destabilizing. China will have very similar perception vis-a-vis, because you are referring essentially that use these missiles as tactical nuclear weapon, not only use sort of covertly, but make it part of the declaratory policy.
Thank you, Ambassador Kantha. Let me amplify this a bit. I would like to make it part of our declaratory policy as missile use minus the nuclear part. So that insofar as China is concerned, our policy of nuclear weapon use has not changed. That the missiles themselves are nuclear capable will remain so. So this, we would need to state that there is a deployment of tactical, short-range, tactical and operational range missile weapons which are part of our defense posture vis-a-vis China, the Indo-Tibet border and the Tibetan plateau, without altering our nuclear. Now, in all discussions on the nuclear, in which armed forces officials as well as ME officials have been attending and the academics who have studied it, there has always been the stated assumption that while this is our policy and we will abide by it, that doesn't mean that we will never use nuclear weapons. Should it be necessary to use, that option has been created. Right from the Homi Bhabha days, that was stated. That was an understated background to the nuclear policy from Pandit Nehru's time and Homi Bhabha. So, to Ambassador Kantha, I would say that we would need to state, otherwise it will create a problem of China saying that you have nuclear missiles positioned against us. So we would need to declare that these are, they're carrying conventional warheads. It would cause a bit of a problem, whether it is the similar destabilizing issue or not. I would say it's an incremental force posture with state that these are non-nuclear. If required to use it, if anything happens, once one side has used it, then it's a free-for-all. I'm not really in favor of the use of nuclear weapons as a war-fighting measure, unlike what the Pakistanis say, and also, in spite of the fact that I come from a family which my father was very happy that the Japanese had been nuked by the Americans because he was a prisoner of war of the Japanese at the time. He wouldn't have come back alive otherwise. So we, as a family, we've never had anything against nuclear weapons, so to speak. But it's a terribly dangerous thing to escalate into, because escalation control is not something that has been tied up between us and China to any extent, certainly not between us and Pakistan. We are groping in the dark with Pakistan on this subject. With China, they don't even want to talk with us because they give us this one that you're not nuclear, so we can't talk to you as actually. So I would qualify and amplify my earlier statement. With Pakistan as a separate issue, I would like actually to declare that we are not going to use tactical nuclear weapons and actually withdraw from them from there. Because if they use even the smallest one, it's going to be massive. We don't need battlefield nuclear weapons. We need what we have, the larger ones. Thank you.
You have just stated that we need not be afraid of Chinese belligerence from the Tibetan side because of the, the geography, mountainous area, etc. Because they cannot, deploy aircraft, very big aircraft. But from the southern side, near Maldives, the seaside, they are building up their forces, both in terms of submarines and aircraft carriers and whatever else. So do we need to be concerned about what is happening from the seaside rather than from the Tibetan side, from China?
Thank you for the question. It's not a deterrence subject, but nevertheless, with Maldives in the news, and we seem to have lost the influence battle there for the moment, where they were more pro-India. Now they seem to be more pro-Chinese because the Chinese have been very active there. But as I said, to have a position of dominance in the Indian Ocean region, particularly with these nearer island groups and smaller countries around, is something that we need to attend to by building up the surface combatants of the Navy and our carrier groups. We can't afford carrier battle groups like the US Navies, and nor do we have the world policing role or a completely world power role. So since we don't have that, we do need to influence the Indian Ocean region with surface combatants, which includes air and perhaps a certain amount of sea denial capability, if not, even if we don't have a sea denial policy, which means submarines, hunter-killer submarines and so on. So yes, we should be concerned. Is it part of a deterrent policy? No. I would not say deterrent policy has anything to do with Chinese naval activity off the Maldives. It is a routine issue that we would like to, or should be routine for the Navy, I'm sure it is like to maintain a strong enough posture in the immediate Indian Ocean region to be able to dissuade extensive Chinese naval activity. The certain amount of diplomatic you cannot stop, and the legal position is the Chinese Navy can actually deploy anywhere they like in the Indian Ocean up to 12 nautical miles of our coast, and there's really nothing you can do about it legally, because that's the position we are taking as part of the, we are not on their side as far as South China Sea is concerned, and since we are taking this position, then we have to accept that it can be done to us also. We have to try and dominate to the extent that they don't do it by having a much stronger Navy and hassle them the way the Chinese hassle American vessels in the South China Sea, come close up and go up in front of the bows and stuff like that. I mean, actual physical threaten to ram them and stuff like that. So it's not a part of deterrence. Does that answer your question, or does it muddy the waters further?
I had only one point. Is not some signaling going on regarding this tactical weapons when we are, I think, having plans to have those land attack BrahMos missiles in Arunachal and even in Chabua in Dibrugarh?
So if you say the presence of our BrahMos missiles, I was just counting them along with the missiles. Okay, fine. Yes, they are missiles. It's a different profile. They are capable. They have decent range. I wonder if we have sufficient numbers, but we certainly should be aiming at them. It's part of your missile weaponry, and I would put it in the same category for usage as having the Prithvi 1, 2 and 3 and the newer Prahar that is under development at the moment. There's huge number of articles available on Google if you search regarding the new Prahar, and the earlier Prithvi 1 and 2 and 3 is what we were talking about in terms of Indian tactical nuclear missiles. I would say use the same minus the missile, minus the nuclear in the declaratory issue. They're always nuclear capable. And in fact, China has made things more difficult for us, since you bring up this issue, by reorganizing so that the military reorganization has removed the 2nd Artillery, which was a strategic nuclear force. They made it a rocket force, which includes the conventional. Even by title, they have changed it. So it's become the rocket force, which means when one of them takes off and comes towards you, in nuclear missile debates and in this entire world of study, which is the nuclear missiles, you have these choices of launch on preparation, and so on, or second strike. Now you don't know what's coming at you. It could be a huge, a very large ballistic missile with multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, MIRVs as they're called, MIRVs, but we don't know whether they're conventional or nuclear. So since they've done that and they intend to use it, they say so. I mean, if you read their last white papers and all their declaratory papers, they say we're going to use everything that we have. So they're going to use their missiles, whether with nuclear weapons or non-nuclear weapons. We are in a quandary as to what to do with those. We don't have a sufficient BMD, we can't afford it. I mean, I have a theory on the BMD, but I don't want to go into it now. And the point being that if we have the missiles, we build them. The point I was making is that we shouldn't be deploying them at all against Pakistan, but this is where we could use them and we could declare that these are not nuclear, but they are short-range missiles, ballistic missiles. Does it help with your question? I had not mentioned cruise missiles, but they would fall in the same category as your short-range ballistic missiles. I mean, except that they are not ballistic; they fly parallel to the ground.
Thank you, Ambassador Kantra, for giving me this opportunity to ask a question. First of all, let me congratulate Colonel Gautam Das for I'm sure it's a very important book and the subject. I'm saying this thing because of my own limitations about this subject. And even if I'm not from this background, it should not deter people like me to read the book. That's what I wanted to say. And now, I don't have a question per se, but it's a query. And I normally don't ask questions to friends and colleagues in public forums because we keep discussing all the time these things. But I'm asking this because I thought you would have expected me to ask something to you since I've come here. So my one-line query is very simple, that during your career, active career, and even post-retirement, have you ever indulged in the game of Wei Qi, that Chinese, but in English it's known as Go, that game. And I'm asking this thing because I know you said that your book, you left out the diplomatic or the geo-strategic dimensions and you concentrated on the warfare, etc. And since for obvious limitations, I can't ask anything on that front. So therefore I'm asking this thing. And in case, let me warn you also, in case if your question is not affirmative, then this query should be seen as a very serious question.
Right. So let's start by saying it is a very serious question. I am aware of Wei Qi and the Japanese word for it, Go, which has now come into English, both being the same game. I am aware of how it is played, and I am also aware that the Chinese, they take it seriously, they play it. But then I don't also play chess. I mean, I don't play chess as well. I did play drafts a few times when I was a boy. But I've not been very particularly fond of these board games. I mean, Ludo and Snakes and Ladders apart at a particular time. But seriously though, I'm aware that it is a great game, that it sharpens the mind and that they play it consciously. And that they are applying all the principles needed to play Wei Qi to their geo-strategic movements. I mean, Djibouti, Gwadar, Hambantota, Maldives, these are all part of a very similar game plan. Undoubtedly, without playing Wei Qi, the US armed forces have been doing a similar thing, but then they are a force projection armed force. Their commands are not within the US. They're not deployed, their army is not deployed in the US. Their central command extends up to the Arabian Sea. I mean, I was one of those who was in the initial, I was involved to a limited extent in the initial briefings of General Claude M. Kicklighter, US Army, Deputy Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Deputy Sink-Pack as the Americans call them. He's the one who initiated the strategic cooperation between the US Armed Forces and India. And this is before I left the army. And the Americans look at things globally in a similar way without actually playing Weichi. So, I mean, he used to say, oh, you know, he joking. I had to brief him once on desert operations. That was another area I used to be good at once upon a time, desert warfare. So the army had asked me to brief him in the middle of the desert, outside Jaisalmer. And so I briefed General Kicklighter on, this was before Gulf War I, just before, a few months before. He had come with a team. Spoke in Delhi, I mean, they had discussions in Delhi, and you can see the Kicklighter proposals are on the net, you can see them. So I had to brief him. We were flown out and so on, at a place called Dhanana outside Jaisalmer. It was a BSF post where I had to brief him. So he says, you know, Colonel, you must come and visit me in Honolulu. Who's sending, I mean, this was before the army turned into sending people all over the place. And he says, you know, we are deployed from Hollywood to Bollywood. His term. This was the Pacific Command. So he says, the Pacific Command is, and it actually is. I mean, they have the west coast of the US and all the way to the Arabian Seas. I mean, his term was, we are deployed, we are responsible for the area from Hollywood to Bollywood. And, which I heard for the first time from this American general, Lieutenant General Gautam Kicklighter. Because westwards from this Arabian Sea is the US Central Command. The Chinese are deployed within their country, around the edges, like us. The US is deployed all around the world, so they're already playing Weichi without calling it Weichi. So I plead guilty. The answer is not in the affirmative. I'm ignorant. I haven't played it, but I do understand the implications. And someday you teach me, I'll play with you. I'm sure to lose, but nevertheless.
Thank you. I think the same as continuing from what Gautam said. I don't want to ask you a question, but I was thinking that when you talked about all this, two things. One is, are we little late in the game? Because the army and the warfare itself is changing so much with cyber and other, all this things, the works are happening. We are still talking about mountain warfare in the traditional way. Secondly, have you thought of the budgetary issues involved in that?
Sorry?
The budget. Yeah.
I'll leave it.
I have talked of budget restrictions confining our thought processes on mountain warfare, because what I have advocated here is actually movement by helicopters. So therefore, what I would like for mountain warfare is what you are, not what you are accusing me of.
No, I'm not. But I thought...
No, wait one. What I would really like, because it is so slow on foot, he and I have both done it, we know how slow it can be and how miserably difficult it is and how dangerous it is if you have to come downhill at night. Whether it is on icy slopes or on slippery, rain-covered, steep mountains in Arunachal Pradesh or Nagaland or anywhere else. So I have advocated a use of, obviously, the ordinary foot infantry wherever it's possible, but all movement to the extent possible, preferably by helicopters. Now that costs money. So I've not had a discussion on the budgetary aspect. I'll tell you why. You know, most people who write military books write after a good deal of experience, 30 years, 35 years, nearly 40 years. They only get to that level of service by becoming generals. In other words, most of these books are written by Major General, Lieutenant General, Major Generals and Lieutenant Generals. Now when they reach that particular level, then they want to write on stuff at that particular level. They don't write books like this, which also includes the ground level, which is why I've deliberately included a lot of the ground level practical things, because by the time you get to that level, then you want to talk about how the budget is, used and what is being cut out and what we should do and what we should buy more of or less of and why this is a problem and why that is not a problem. Incidentally, the defense budget, you should read this new book coming out tomorrow by Lieutenant General Philip Campos, which he delves a lot into the budget because he's been vice chief. Before that, he's been in perspective planning directorate twice, right? He's really been up there. But then he was also one of the first people to take a mechanized infantry company to the edge of the plateau when he was a major. But now that he's been a general for many years and then retired for the last few years, now he only talks about strategy and the budget. So instead of me, the officers at that level, they actually write most of that stuff. So there are a lot of people. I have just said that there are budgetary constraints. It has been brought down from this one to this much, and leave it at that. For the simple reason that there are others writing about it. I mean, if I were to do that, it wouldn't be a book on mountain warfare. It would become a book on procurement of equipment for mountain warfare. You get the point, right? It may not answer your question entirely, but in brief, I have talked about the budget only to say that there are budgetary problems without going into nitty-gritties of it, right? Because I've talked about an air assault brigade. They're expensive. I'd love to have an air assault brigade, right? I'd like to have an air movement brigade. I'd like to have the US 1st Cavalry Division, which they've given up, and recreate one of our own, which was it was the 1st Air Cavalry Division. But money.
Well, so I think now we'll bring the discussion to closer. Thank you very much, Colonel Gautam Das, for both fascinating presentation and discussion we had after that. So let's give him a big round of applause, both for the book and for what we had this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.